Yeah, so I actually have a little presentation to do tonight in it's a minute issues of composition class, which is one of my tech writing courses, but it's more about um, digital rhetoric. And so what we've actually done is we've been reading, for instance, doing my presentation on a book by a guy named Kelly, talking about what technology wants, and it's pretty interesting. So I'm going to get into basically he coins a bunch of neologisms, if you will, new terms, not a bunch, but mainly one, to talk about the influence of technology. Calls it the technium, very amorphous term that essentially refers to technology and the application of it within society, and likens it to a living, self-replicating system. But he is somewhere in the middle if you're talking about a techno-positivist versus a techno-negative. So if you want an idea of the spectrum, you would have the Unabomber being a techno-negative guy, and a techno-positivist would be like Ray Kurzweil, like a transhumanist who believes that technology is an absolute good. This guy is somewhere in the middle, and he actually elucidates his position quite well in the essay because he talks about. If you want to just read through the article, why don't I do that? What's great is I have this on my 40-inch television. It's probably not good for my eyes. So he's saying that Technium has autonomy. So this grand technical system is self-replicating and does what it wants. So his example here is that E. coli is somewhat autonomous in our gut, but he's also saying that we are not fully autonomous because of things like this. Self-repair, self-defense, self-regulation. Now, he's going to say, though, of course, that the Technium does this, and there are many examples of self-repairing networks. And with the application of AI to networks, you're going to see that quite a lot more, I would think. Now, he does say that there are self-reproducing computer viruses, but they don't prove so. That's actually kind of not true. There are viruses that can actually do that now, especially in response to defense. So this is interesting. There are 170 quadrillion computer chips wired up in a 1 megascale computing platform. Now it's approximately the same as the number of neurons in our brain. So the global network would have the computing power of what has way more computing power than the human, individual human mind, but theoretically it should have the ability to be conscious. It consumes 5% of the world's electricity. So what he says here is that a small percentage of these transmissions, errors in code, networking transmissions, can't be accounted for. So it's kind of mysterious. He's saying the Technium is whispering to itself. Of course, that just means in reality that our detection methods aren't good enough to understand that. And he's saying now that of course, what he's saying here is deep analysis of information flowing through the Technium's network reveals that it is slowly being shifting in its methods of organization. He's comparing the telephone to our networks now. That's obvious, obviously kind of not a good comparison because it's quite a lot more complicated. And of course, systems do generate their own momentum, and that's kind of what he's referring to. It has a common root with the human mind, but also with ancient life and other self-organized systems. So here's where he addresses what technology wants. He says, that's a question of the essay, right? So the Technium wants to sort itself out, to self-assemble into hierarchical levels, just as most large, deeply interconnected systems do. The Technium also wants every living system wants to perpetuate itself and keep going, gaining in complexity and force. So a protozoan has wants in the sense that it has a drive. So perhaps his phrase want isn't good here. What you want is to consider the drive of this technical system. He addresses that here. What the Technium want does not mean thoughtful decisions. It's not conscious. Okay. So his goal, as stated here, is to minimize damage and allow us to reap the blessings of technology. Of course, chimps make tools. That's what he's saying here. Termites construct vast towers of mud. We knew that. Ants herd aphids and farm fungi in gardens. We knew that. Birds use twiggy fabrics for their nests. Octopuses are intelligent. 2 million years ago, we chipped stone to give ourselves claws. 200,000 years ago, we developed cooking. Spears have been around 100,000 years. Making the point that manufactured technology is actually part of nature as well. It's just a very complex issue, very complex evolution of it. So the latest date for the development of Sapiens, capital S, would have been 100,000 years ago, and that coincided with the Neanderthals and Erectus. Of course, our tools were the same, but then eventually we shifted upwards in terms of our ability to make tools. That was during the Mesolithic. And about 50,000 years ago, we definitely changed, probably due to probably due to the development of language, which there's an inherent debate in language whether or not it's hard coded in human brains or whether we have to learn it. You'll see a population graph here, where, basically indicating our rise of population around that time. 5,000 years, they overtook Europe. Another 15,000 years, and they reached Asia. Once we crossed into Alaska, it took only a few thousand years to fill the whole new world. We basically expanded at 1 mile per year. Meaning we're the most invasive species ever. Of course, we've invented traps, various ways to fish. Region by region, we're innovating. We made warm clothes that allowed us to get to the Arctic, which is also an outgrowth of our ability to hunt. Now, we displaced the hominin species on Earth, including the Neanderthals. They were only 18,000 at any point. They vanished in 100 generations. No intermediates in the fossil record, so they basically just were exterminated. Demographers here, here's what's interesting. Demographers here calculate that only a little as a 4% difference in reproductive effectiveness could eclipse the lesser breeding species in a few thousand years. So the fact that the Neanderthal birth rate was lower by 4% would have meant that they were extinct just by itself. Of course, there's interbreeding and there's also conflict. Here's where he addresses that whatever happened 50,000 years ago that gives us that adaptive advantage for development of tools is language. Daniel Dennett. There's no more uplifting, more momentous step in the history of mind design than the invention of language. Of course, the real question here is what type of language other hominin species had, like Neanderthals. I mean, it's theorized they might have had like sign language because they didn't have a larynx. Now they are actually theorizing how language came about. Might be tool use. Each throw requires a long succession of precise neural instructions executed in a split second. Once the brain developed the ability to understand the ability to throw, use tools, do these rapid fire hunting techniques, then maybe it developed notions, thought pictures, and these thought pictures eventually had to be assigned some type of internal shorthand. He's talking about the hunter-gatherer health, basically meaning that they were able to secure enough calories to live, eating around 2,000 calories a day. So that's where it ends, but this is the beginning of a book. So yeah, he's essentially saying that technology is akin to a force of nature now. It's kind of a natural outgrowth. Another reading we did by a guy named Clark was about the fact that we are natural born cyborgs. And he uses a few examples to elucidate the fact that we are configured to extend our own consciousness onto our reality through the use of mathematics, language, tool making, etc. So it's kind of similar in that regard. Now, he does mention that the word technology is derived from, of course, Attic Greek phrase used by Aristotle, techne, which just means technique. Later, it's coined into German by a German in the 19th century in order to refer to what we know as technology. You get a lot of his boring life story. He's a hippie, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't have all these technical devices. He's been to Silicon Valley. Art and technique. He basically having technique was akin to, being a craftsman. The German is Beckmann, an economic professor at Göttingen University in Germany. He coined the word technology. Networks, especially electronic networks, exhibit near biological behavior. So, of course, if you've seen a network, um, it looks like dendrons and axons and myelin sheaths in the mind, right? So if you've seen that in a neurological example, and you've compared that to a logical or physical topology in a network, it's pretty obvious that there's correlation there. In fact, we are a network. We're a network of nerves and hormones and all that. And you can look at society as a network if you want to look at it as that perspective as well. Now, he talks about immunocomputing here. That's an interesting concept. So, biologists are learning that living systems can be imbued with the abstracted essence of mechanical process like computation. For instance, researchers discovered that DNA, the actual DNA found in ubiquitous bacteria, E. coli, and our own intestines, could be used to compute the answers to difficult mathematical problems as a computer. So, what they're trying to do now is like a biotech. There's research into this. This is kind of like a transhuman emerging technology, but they're trying to use that to establish, computing in the same way we're doing research into quantum computing as well. The best of technology was becoming incredibly disembodied. Basically, that abstractions are becoming the norm in regards to technology. Is technology human or non-human? An interesting correlation here. If 1,000 lines of letters in Unix qualifies as a technology, then 1,000 lines of letters in English must qualify as well. A Shakespeare sonnet and a Bach fugue then are the same category as a Google search engine and the iPod. There's a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, which makes this exact type of correlation. It's quite an interesting accomplishment. The guy that wrote it will won a Nobel Prize. I do want to read it and talk about it one of these days. I've read it already. It's crazy. It was kind of above me at the time. Went over my head. Now he's making the case for the neologism technium. Okay, here's how he comes up with the concept of technium. The term culture falls short in one critical way. It's too small. So technology is, of course, across cultures now. It is perhaps outside of the emerging global monoculture. It has self-propelling momentum, and he says, I dislike inventing words that no one else uses, and he calls it the technium. The technium extends beyond shining hardware to include culture, art, social institutions, and intellectual corrections of all types. It includes intangibles like software, law, and philosophical concepts. It includes the generative impulses of our inventions to encourage more toolmaking and more technology invention and more self-enhancing connections. For the rest of the book, I will use the term technium where others might use technology as a plural and mean a whole system, as in technology accelerates. The technium accelerates the invention of technologies, and that's true. As we become better programmers, right? We have scripts that are there. We have self-correcting systems across the board. And as we get better at using them, we're better at designing them and so forth and so on, and they just build one on top of the other. As more fields are invented, more people are required to be trained in this, and then you have cascading, snowballing effect of technology. And of course, by bringing up these old examples, he's saying that this is not new. It's not, the end. There was also another reading we did, which is by a guy named Carr. It's Google making us stupid. So that thesis is pretty common. You have a lot of people, myself included, who notice our attention spans are getting less, but that's by design if you're using social media. So it's also something that was pointed out in The Dumbest Generation, as the title of the book, that people are less able to think. They're using computers to do so. I don't know whether that's entirely valid, but that's a techno-negative position. That's kind of a primitivist argument, which I don't have a lot of sympathy for, because again, primitivism has its various downsides. All right, so you're saying how many neurons do you need to have a mind? Yeah, so back to where I was. But yeah, the key thing here is obviously the technium isn't conscious yet, and it's not capable of self-direction. It does have its own momentum, though. That's all he's saying.